Shoreside Power, Clean Fuels, and Air Quality. I'm Joseph Sutkowi. I'm the Chief Waterfront Design Officer at Waterfront Alliance. Excited about this panel today, where we're going to talk about a number of different ways that the port infrastructure in our city and around the country is introducing sustainable practices, thinking about hydrogen, e-fuels, electric vessels, all of the things that are what ports of the future will look like. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists, and then we've got a series of questions for folks, and we'll hold some time at the end for any questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with Tanja, the Senior Program Manager for Port Sustainability and Resilience with the Port Department of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. She advances strategies and policies and technological implementations that align with the agency's environmental sustainability policy and support the agency's greenhouse gas reduction targets. Alisa at the end is the Director of C40's Ports and Shipping Program, working to connect port cities, ports, and related public and private sector stakeholders, and sharing knowledge and developing and implementing solutions that are going to improve public health, mitigate greenhouse gases, and focus not just on the ports, but the full supply chain. We have David Tyler, co-founder of Artemis Technologies, which is a developer of zero-emission vessels. He is the managing director of the company's North America division, based here in New York. And then finally, we have Fern, a climate campaign director at Pacific Environment, where she leads the Ports for People campaign that's focused on accelerating and decarbonization of ports and shipping industry, works closely with portside communities, port authorities, and operators and regulators across the country. So with that, I'd love to jump in straight into some of the questions. Ports and ferries are already grappling with air quality mandates, climate targets, community pressure. Often all of those pressures are happening at the same time. From where you sit, and we can just go right in order down the line. From where you sit, what's the most important shift that's happening right now that's making green maritime solutions viable rather than something that even a couple of years ago was still hypothetical? You want to start?
Sure. So right now, I think, despite everything else that's going on in the world, I think we've seen a lot of vessels come to our port that are alternatively fueled. So we see increased demand for that, and I think things are moving in the direction of new fuels. On the funding side for infrastructure, we've seen a record investment into infrastructure and have received a Clean Ports Program grant. So that allows us to move ahead with targets that are in line with our net zero roadmap.
Great, and I've got a few slides to do. Should I do that now or do that? Yeah. So I thought I kind of might show you an example of what's happening and what's going on around the world, and particularly with us. So Artemis Technologies, we were an America's Cup sailing team. Some of you may have seen these boats flying around New York a few years ago, and there's going to be Sail GP, which is happening in 2 weeks' time. So that boat there, Magic Blue, is going to be on that race course in a couple of weeks. So we were racing these amazing boats, so going 60 mile an hour, huge jump in efficiency driven by this hydrofoiling tech. And so we established a company really to address the challenge of electrification of maritime transport. Water is 800 times denser than air, so simply putting batteries in current vessel designs just wasn't feasible at all. They were limited by range, limited by speed, and just weren't able to be deployed. And I think that's been a bit of a challenge where people have looked at electrification and kind of said, no, there's nothing here, there isn't a solution that actually works. But we're kind of addressing that challenge. So this is our tech. It's called the Artemis e-foiler system. So it uses these hydrofoils, or this wing under the boat. So as the boat lifts up out of the water, reduces the drag, increases the efficiency, and uses anywhere between 70 to 90% less energy, depending on the sea state. So you can see here as well, the vessel's really easy to use. There's an autonomous flight control system, so it's kind of like part aeroplane, part submarine, part car. An powerful electric drive unit, which has been re-engineered from those used in Formula One. Lots of benefits to this technology. It's not just green, but because Because it's so much more efficient, the costs to operate these boats, the fuel costs are lower, the charging infrastructure is lower as well compared to a displacement boat because you're using less energy. The boats also fly above the water, which means that you can avoid speed restrictions, so ferry services or crew transfer boats or pilot boats can actually operate at high speed in places where they weren't allowed to before. And I think the thing that I kind of wanted to really stress is that, you know, technology like this is here, it's out there, it's available today. We don't necessarily have to wait anymore. So here there's just some examples of work boats up in Scotland. This is the pilot boat demonstration in Ireland. But what does that look like in terms of kind of ferry operation and business? So this is really an example of the NYC ferry service between Wall Street and Rockaway. And so the kind of cost of fuel today, prior to the Iranian special operation that's happening, was $5 million on fuel, and with implementation of our electric foiling boats on that, or the kind of energy or fuel cost, electricity cost, almost cuts in half. And so although there's kind of a capex on the tech, the technology pays for itself because of that jump in efficiency.
Okay, so can folks hear me okay? Thanks. I mainly focus on reducing policy actions and advocacy to reduce shipping emissions, so especially when they dock at ports. So, and with that, there is a technology called shore power that has been around for a long time. So in terms of the technology side, you know, it's matured, it's available, it does still cost a lot, but I think the main thing that I've seen different to kind of really driven the uptake of this new technology is both on the regulatory side, like EU has passed a new mandate recently that is requiring ports in the European countries to provide shore power systems for ships to plug in. Like large shipping countries like China is also mandating that with enforcement via fines. You know, Singapore, South Korean, another big trading partners of the US, they are also leading the front there, where the largest 5 ports that they have the mandate for ships to plug in. So there's like regulatory driver, but I'll also say that you know, to the point that David made, both ports and carriers themselves are seeing the benefits of fuel cost saving technologies like shore power. So for example, you know, at the port of New York, New Jersey, I believe about 30% of ships already that come to the port already have this technology and can plug in. I'm actually from the West Coast. For ports on the West Coast, we're seeing kind of, you know, up to 90% of ship calls coming to the ports of California that can and do plug in. So I would say it's sort of like a combination of that economics as well as regulations.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Alisa, Kreynes, Director of Ports and Shipping at C40 Cities. Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction. Just very briefly on C40 Cities, we are a network of mayors of the world's largest cities working together on climate action. And in my role, I oversee our work in the maritime sector, which means bringing together ports, cities, and the shipping industry to help them reduce emissions, improve air quality, and bolster local economies. So I will answer the question both from a sort of a broad picture perspective as to what are the big shifts that we see happening right now that are accelerating the shift towards decarbonization, and I'll talk about a specific project where we see this happening today in very real world terms. So at the big picture level, I think the biggest shift that's happening right now is that ports are having to reinvent themselves in a sense that they are rethinking their 200-year-old model of where traditionally ports have been transit modes that move carbon and goods. And now they're having to do other things like produce and manage renewable energy. So in a sort of big picture form, the role of ports as a business is changing. And ports are having to rethink how they do business, how do they move commodities, what does it look like in terms of their business model, what does it look like in terms of their consumption, what does it look like in terms of their ability to provide services to their tenants and to their clients. So I have actually a slide that shows some of the work that we've been doing in the space. So we have spent 5+ years working with various ports around the world, ports and cities around the world, to look at the 3 main types of that transformation. Ports are becoming clean energy hubs, ports are becoming clean fuel hubs, and ports are also becoming offshore wind hubs. And these are all very, very important types of pathways of how ports are transforming themselves. So hubs for electrification, I'm sure Tanja will speak to some of the amazing work that's happening at the ports of New York and New Jersey, where ports are actively electrifying all of their operations, installing shore power, making sure that they're able to provide renewable energy and energy supply to their clients, be it ships or be it terminal operators, be it cargo handling equipment or trucks. We're seeing this happen all around the world. Again, we work globally, so we do have experiences and case studies from all over the world. Ports as big as Shanghai and as little as Oslo are all moving in the direction of electrifying everything they can. So lots of great examples out there for how ports are moving towards becoming hubs for electrification. Clean fuel bunkering hubs is another really important shift. Ports are having to rethink their fuel structures. How do they operate their bunkering? And even if they don't currently bunker or are acting as bunkering hubs, what does it mean in terms of the shift to clean fuels? Because fuels like methanol, fuels like hydrogen, ammonia are lower density than fossil fuels. Therefore, there need to be more frequent bunkering, just like there's more electric infrastructure for charging cars, for charging electric vehicles. So very similar trend is what we see happening in the clean fuel bunkering space, where ports that are not currently in the bunkering business are starting to think of how they can start bunkering those fuels. And then finally, offshore wind, which is something we see happening here in New York City. Ports have a very important role to play in enabling and maintaining offshore wind. You cannot build offshore wind farms without ports, and ports have a key role to play in that. So we see that as another very important pathway for transformation. All of these examples are exist in a form of a case study that we've put together with our partner ARP. There is a report available online where you can read many, many case studies of ports that have gone through these pathways, were successfully able to implement some of these measures and are moving in the direction of transformation. Now, what does this look like in terms of the actual project? Where we can see this work happen in the real world. I would like to show you a short video of a green shipping corridor project we launched 4 years ago with the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Shanghai, who got together and said, look, we have one of the busiest container routes in the world, which, by the way, brings almost half of the goods that come into the United States. They come from the San Pedro Bay port complex. And some 15 to 20% of those goods come from Shanghai on that one corridor. So those 3 ports and cities got together and said, we need to decarbonize the shipping route. Can we try to have the first trans-Pacific green shipping corridor where we have zero-emission vessels, where we have 100% shore power capability, where every terminal is electrified? That's what this project is about. And we have already seen a lot of the milestones met on this corridor. Last year, 2025, the corridor successfully met its first milestone of having zero-emission capable ships on this route. We've electrified a lot of the infrastructure at the participating ports, and they continue to make progress on implementing new technologies and introducing new ways of running business. And I will play a very short video so you can see what that looks like in practice.
Over 80% of the world's trade moves across the ocean, with emissions from shipping affecting the air we breathe and the climate we depend on. Addressing these emissions is critical to meeting climate goals, improving air quality, and safeguarding the health of port communities. Green shipping corridors, collaborative efforts between international ports, ocean carriers, and other partners, are creating a path towards a decarbonized maritime future. They cut global maritime emissions while proving commercial, technical, and regulatory feasibility. In 2022, the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Shanghai launched the world's first trans-Pacific green shipping corridor on one of the busiest cargo routes in the world. The corridor has marked significant progress since its launch. Shore power infrastructure is approaching 100% capability, cutting emissions while ships are docked and improving air quality for local communities. Ports are actively supporting the availability of clean energy refueling, with preparations underway in Los Angeles and Long Beach, and regular bunkering of green methanol in Shanghai, helping ships run cleaner and cities breathe easier. Carriers began deploying reduced life cycle carbon-capable vessels in 2022 and continue to prepare fleets for a zero-emission future. While in 2024, the first green methanol container ship completed its voyage on the corridor. These advancements lay the groundwork for continued progress. By 2030, the Green Shipping Corridor aims to demonstrate the feasibility of deploying the world's first zero life cycle carbon emission container ships supported by clean fuel infrastructure. By demonstrating the viability of these next generation vessels, the corridor will continue promoting clean marine fuels, creating good green jobs, and serving as a model of sustainable shipping for decades to come.
All right, thank you for each sharing your work in this space. I want to dive into some follow-up questions on what you're working on. So, Port of New York and New Jersey is the only port in the country that rivals LA and Long Beach in terms of container volume. I'm curious, there are heavy investments in shore power electrification, cleaner equipment across the country, but adoption still does vary pretty significantly. So can you talk about what the biggest barriers to deployment are and how that's shown up in here locally?
So, I mean, in California, there's, of course, at-birth regulation, right? So there's several regulations that mandate that ships plug in and that there's shore power available as a result of it. Neither New York or New Jersey, that's currently a requirement. But based on experience from installing shore power in Brooklyn initially and working on getting shore power now installed in Elizabeth, it's difficult and a long process with our utilities because you need a lot of capacity initially to plug in. And so you need a substation upgrade, you need to coordinate with utility, you sometimes need to find a place for an additional substation in order to support it. So it takes a lot of infrastructure and coordination to make shore power happen, both in New York and in New Jersey. So that's a lot of it. That's at least one of the main reasons. The other reason is that our port is old. The infrastructure is old. It's 100 years. And we're now getting in the long capital process of updating our wharfs. And so in order to just think about starting to install the infrastructure, a lot of the wharfs have to be rebuilt. So we currently, in the last capital plan, we have 180 million dedicated to wharf replacement. And while we're going through the wharf replacement, we are simultaneously also planning and making every effort to continue with at least getting the basics together so that shore power can be installed once the wharf replacement is completed.
Great, and we're thrilled to see that wharf replacement investment starting to manifest. Having worked on it 7 years ago as a consultant.
Yeah.
Love that that's moving forward. So David, I want to turn to you, and at a smaller scale, electric and hybrid vessels are often discussed as the future, but operators are worried about range and cost and charging infrastructure. So what are the right design choices to be made for these vessels, and what are the operational use cases that make the most sense?
Yeah, I think there's not probably one shoe fits all. To be honest, it's really based down to the operation of the vessel in particular, particularly the speed it needs to operate, the distance it needs to do. So I think we've seen the first deployment of sort of slower speed ferries in Norway, almost like 10 years ago. I think the first boats have been operating and have been successfully. And I think displacement electric ferries can do short routes where there's low mileage requirements, a low charging infrastructure requirement. And those sort of operations, we've seen big improvements in energy density of batteries. So things are improving all the time. And Maritime is really gaining the benefit from all the work that's going on in the automotive sector. And I think for sort of high-speed vessels like fast ferries and things, there hasn't really been a solution, but the kind of development in hydrofoiling technology really delivered through the America's Cup and high-performance racing over the last 10 years has really changed the picture in that regard. And for the first time, cities are seeing the opportunity to decarbonise high-speed routes, one, because electric foiling boats can deliver the range, but importantly, when you're in a city like New York and you have 38, EDC, NYC Ferry have 38 of these fast ferries, it's okay to maybe look at, looking at one pilot, but when you're starting to look at electrification of the whole system, then that creates obviously a significant demand from a power perspective, similar to the port's challenges. And so when you're looking at that calculation, you want to have the most efficient vessel operator as possible, and that's where hydrofoiling really comes into its own as well, because if you're using 70% less energy on each voyage, one, you're cutting costs against the conventional diesel, and that's today. So this technology means that your operation is going to be cheaper into the future, but it also makes it feasible and possible.
And as we see kind of more and more shore power being introduced and fewer vessels needing to use diesel, that is going to have climate benefits, but can also have significant community health benefits. So I want to ask Fern, port adjacent communities have lived with diesel pollution long before we were, before Port Authority joined the Paris Climate Accords, and long before any of the climate change conversations were happening. So how can port electrification and clean fuel transitions be designed to deliver measurable health benefits, not just the emission reductions?
I'll go without. It was my own fault because I sent in the slides very late, so apologies to the organizers. But essentially, what I was going to show was emissions inventory at the Port of New York, New Jersey, but also at other ports. And what that shows is the contributions of different pollution sources at the port. And pretty much across the board at all major ports in the US, ship is the largest contributor to both greenhouse gas emissions as well as criteria pollutants, which is what the types of air pollution that is regulated under the Clean Air Act, because it's considered to have significant health impacts. So the good thing about port electrification solutions that many ports, including the Port of New York, New Jersey, are pursuing is that things like shore power or truck electrification, they are helping to reduce criteria pollutants as well as lowering climate emissions. And so when ships can plug into shore power, they can turn off auxiliary engines while they docked and connect to local grid. the grid needs to be clean, obviously. And that really helps reduce the pollution and therefore exposure to ship pollution of nearby communities. And let me just see. And we've seen this proven out in California, where Joseph, you worked at CARB. So yeah, Tanja mentioned already that California has the ship at berth rule, and that rule was expanded in 2020, and based on the analysis, that the implementation of that rule will deliver around 90% of pollution reduction and result in 55% reduction in potential cancer risk for communities nearby the port of LA, Long Beach, and Richmond, so some of the larger ports. So I would say, yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the electrification solutions are, have a lot of those co-benefits.
I also want to, I have a follow-up for you around of how this discussion has really changed from the Biden administration into now the Trump administration.
Oh, wow, yeah. Yes, let me see. Obviously, the high-level messaging and policy direction is the opposite, right? Under the current administration, a lot of the policies and funding are pretty anti-climate mitigation. The administration's been pulling back from climate and environmental justice initiatives. For example, the largest source of funding for ports infrastructure is from a federal program called Port Infrastructure Development Program, PIDP, and which is administered by the Maritime Administration. And the funding criteria under the Biden administration explicitly focused, included Justice 40, which, you know, had broad equity and environmental justice priorities. And that is not the case under the current administration. So ports used to be able to access tens of millions of dollars per port that could win this grant to support their electrification work. In the latest round, most recent round of PIDP, the awards were just announced actually 2 weeks ago. We saw only 2 very small shore power projects being funded. The rest of the applications that won, the money is going towards port expansion, some efficiency improvements, but yeah, some repair, but really we saw almost no clean technologies or clean practices.
So, Alisa, you work globally, and I'm curious, you know, what lessons are emerging from things like the green shipping corridors that even if we're seeing this change at the federal level, that cities should be learning from as they think about kind of using their influence to move forward on decarbonization and other sustainability issues?
Yeah, I think that's one very optimistic change that we're seeing, is that there's a lot more subnational level leadership, not just in the US, but all over the world, that cities, states, and their ports are starting to work very closely together to decarbonize their goods movement. And that is something that we've been seeing an upward trend of, and it is really encouraging. We're seeing some very tangible results of that with projects like Green Shipping Corridor. The video I played in my introduction, that project is a direct outcome of the city leadership. This was, before this project come to exist, it was the mayor of Los Angeles who had a vision of having a green corridor across the Pacific Ocean and working with China, because that is one of LA's biggest trading partners. And so that vision, the ambition came from the city. Then 2 other cities joined the project, and now the city stays closely involved in all of the sort of day-to-day work of the corridor. And I think we've been seeing this consistently throughout a lot of our projects in various parts of the world. So I think that's one thing that, you know, is definitely encouraging. And the lack of federal support within this country, We're still seeing a lot of subnational leadership on both coasts and the Gulf Coast, to some extent in the port decarbonization space. So the other thing I would say is, cities do have many levers in their power that they can use to decarbonize their ports, right? One obvious one would be to work closely with their ports. Cities have climate action plans. Almost every city now in the US or in many other parts of the world has a climate action plan. Many cities are starting to include their ports and supply chains in the climate action plans, which means to the points that Fern was making about having emissions inventories, you have to be able to measure so you can manage, right? We have to know what does the emission profile look like, what are the sources of emissions, to manage them, to reduce them. And so cities are starting to become a lot more proactive in including ports and decarbonization pathways into their climate action plans. One, I would give you some examples. For example, Los Angeles just updated their climate action plan at the city level that includes clean fuels, electrification, clean trucks, and a lot of the work that's happening on the green corridors. So very specific about things that the city wants to achieve, which in its turn helps the city allocate the resources and secure potentially state funding to do that. And then some of the other levers to mention is demand aggregation, which I know is a big topic, and we're probably out of time to talk about that. But definitely locally driven demand aggregation for new technologies and fuels.
So one of the things that we see, as things moved kind of to this subnational level, is that there's a lot. If you're a given port, or in New York and New Jersey's case, a tenant operator at a port, you have a lot of different options for the types of infrastructure that you use. Nothing has really changed the transportation world quite the way that containerizing shipping has. That standardized how we moved goods globally. Is there a standardization that's needed for electrification infrastructure? Or how do you kind of balance, or what does it take maybe to align ports and utilities and vessel manufacturers? Maybe start with David and Tanja.
I think on the shore power side, there has been some standardization that's been going on. I think generally speaking, if you're talking about getting infrastructure installed in order to electrify, I think permitting simplification, right, across sectors would help. Identifying like early adopters or ideal candidates for early adopters. They may not all be the big cities, right? Like there might be corridors that are more advantageous, more power is available, and the routes are shorter, for example, for trucks that might actually be better fits. I mean, I think there's something to be said figuring out like early adoption regions and identifying some sort of simplified permit process in order to facilitate it. And also, like if you're thinking about like grant applications and in support of it that come locally, like think about how you create, what compliance mechanism you have, and what makes sense, so they can actually like incentivize the investment into charging infrastructure and charging hubs.
Yeah, and I think from the vessel side, there's an opportunity for standardization of the connector. So for us, we're using the CCS on the smaller vessels, and then the MCS charger, which is being tested and deployed to charge trucks at the moment. So I think maritime is kind of a smaller industry compared to others. It probably doesn't necessarily have all the R&D power and the investment in there. And so any way there's an opportunity to leverage technology from the automotive space, then we definitely need to take advantage of that. And I would say within the charging arena, that's certainly the case, and we can see it happening today.
So start thinking of questions from the audience. We'll go to that next. I'll ask one kind of lightning round question, one sentence from each. And I've not had a panel all day that stuck to one sentence, but we're going to try it. One sentence each. In the next 3 to 5 years, we'll say, what single action by ports, cities, operators, regulators would most accelerate the shift to cleaner maritime systems? Start?
4 words. How's 4 words? Local action for global impact.
I wrote something down, but I'm changing my mind. But mandating and funding zero emission port operations at scale and making carriers pay for it.
I think it's two. I think it's that, and I think the second one is having a funding mechanism to de-risk deployment of pilots. So whether it's California Core, which is by CARB, or there's the WASIT program in Washington State. There isn't anything here in New York at the moment for marine space, and there needs to be.
Funding and regulation.
Great, great. So thank you for sticking to the one sentence. What questions do folks in the audience have for the panel? Go ahead.
Hi. So Fern mentioned this earlier that with the current administration, federal funding dried up for the greenifying the ports. You mentioned that they did get funding for repairing or upgrading. Are they able to like sneak in green tech within that and get creative, or is it, and like they're able to subvert in that way, or are we kind of just stuck?
And I'm going to repeat the question just so the video picks it up, and you can grab the mic for the next question. So the question was, with funding drying up under the current administration, is there a way to kind of sneak in green infrastructure funding and electrification into proposals for other projects?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think 100% there is. I think you just have to change the narrative to meet the narrative of the current administration. So although there's been a drive around climate and social and climate justice, there has been a big drive behind a kind of returning US shipbuilding to the prowess it had before, this kind of golden generation of innovation. And so if you can find an opportunity to change the narrative to say how it supports shipbuilding, it supports jobs here in the US, it supports deployment of the highest technology in the world within the US, not to mention the kind of electrification aspects, but focus on those parts, then yeah, I see how it meets their requirements, and I think it will go through.
I'll add that part of it is narrative, and part of it is, you don't say anything about that, and you use your money differently and shift it around. So I haven't looked at all of the awarded applications in detail, but one would hope that, if a port has received funding to repair their wharves, that means they can spend less of their capital, and so use their own capital in more flexible ways. But the other thing is also, if they are getting funding to repair their wharves, they're doing what Tanja and her team are doing, which is like prepare the wharf in a way that is future-proofed, that it's going to be accommodating to shore power and things. And to David's point, the U.S. Maritime, so the federal administration released this what's called like U.S. Maritime Action Plan, and which precipitates from this like restoring America's maritime dominance effort. And actually, even within that plan itself, there is a recognition that in order for ports in the US to maintain global competitiveness, you need things like shore power. So even within that plan released by this administration, there's just a small mention, but they don't want to make noises around, kind of big noises around it. They just sort of slip through.
Other questions?
I don't know if mine's a question, more a question or more a comment, but I guess I'll use the mic. Can everybody hear me? So I'm just kind of curious. So I live in Massachusetts, but I worked for a long time at the Port of Long Beach. So from the West Coast, I've lived in the East Coast since 2012. Michael Van Beek with GHD. One of the things, so I think it was Fern that mentioned this. So very familiar with what Noelle's doing in Long Beach. The difference, I think, on the East Coast, in addition to what you said, Tanja, is the West Coast. You've got from Washington, you only have 3 states. Washington, Oregon, down to California, they're all aligned from a policy perspective, more or less, in terms of, you have the at-berth regulations in California, but Oregon and Washington are very much in that same space. So you have to go to Canada or Mexico to avoid those regulations. And I think the problem on the East Coast is that you have a lot more states with ports. So in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Baltimore, they need to be aligned. Otherwise, you're going to have competition between those markets, and you'll just work around where the regulation is. So, and it's a problem because New York, New Jersey doesn't want to bleed cargo to Baltimore. And so they're not going to put in policies that are going to divert cargo to Baltimore. So Maryland has to be aligned. So does Virginia. So does Massachusetts, right? Otherwise, cargo will spill over to the path of least resistance and less regulation. So that's just a thought. And the other thing that comes to mind is somebody mentioned CARB earlier. And is there any consideration for, because when I'm a port planner, worked in the industry for over 20 years. The problem with shore power is the energy consumption, right? Especially when you're decarbonization cargo handling equipment simultaneously. It's a 6x increase in power demand, and it's causing brownouts in California. Let's be realistic. Oh, it is. It is. I know it is. And it's a problem. But in California, what I think CARB did that was really smart is the cake system. So they have a CARB-approved emissions capture system, which is shore power alternative, and it's basically the bonnet barges. Has anyone in the Northeast or New York, New Jersey considered an alternative like that? It's basically a bonnet on a barge, right? So you're capturing the emissions. Is that something that would be viable in this market or no?
We did think about it for NOx capture this a couple of years ago for a grant application, and then I think like the way our port is situated in the berth, there was like really no space in order for the barge and all the other vessels to move around there. And it was also like an earlier, and it would have funded for a pilot project for I think like 3 years. Part of the reason we had a huge holdup is because it was CMAQ funded, and it was difficult to figure out like how the Buy America application that was at that point strictly implemented would work and get using the grant funding for the project.
But like Stax is deployed at scale now in California.
Yeah.
And it seems to work. It's expensive, but it works.
Yeah. It's cheaper than shore power, but it's
cheaper than shore power
not
from a
as
CapEx
clean.
perspective, not
Yeah.
from an OpEx.
Yeah, not from an OpEx perspective. I mean, ideally, you have to figure out like how you supply enough power.
A question in the back.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great presentation. Scott Liger with Moffett & Nickel. Shore power, I've designed a lot of systems. It's got some really great pros and some really great cons in certain locations. Just, of course, downstream, if your generation has a lot of fossil fuel inputs, even if you electrify the whole port, your emissions are just shifting. They're just going to another location. But there's a lot of benefits as well. But I think the question I have for the panel is, as you look at shore power technology and the useful life of certain equipment of being 20 years, for each panelist, do you think investment in clean fuels and clean fuel systems, because engine technologies are increasing, is a better long-term investment if you only had $1 to spend, or should we be committing more resources to shore power side investments?
You can start. Okay. I think we still need the shore power. What we're hearing from ports around the world, big and small, whether the ship runs on HFO or methanol or hydrogen or ammonia, it still has to plug in, because you're not going to be running your engine at berth for multiple days to offload and load containers, regardless of the type of fuel you're burning. So I think shore power is a must, regardless of the pathway to the clean fuel.
Yeah, I'll just add partly because at the start and right now and probably for the next 10 years at least, alternative fuels like e-methanol, e-ammonia are going to be more expensive still, and so I don't know that the economics will work out, and it could, not in all places, but in certain states and at certain ports, it will still be cheaper to plug in. And just in terms of overall efficiency, being able to plug into a clean grid is going to be much more efficient way to to keep running that ship for 3 days rather than, producing fuels, whether it's current type of fuel or alternative fuels, and which is going to take way more energy than if plugs just plug in.
I think there's low-hanging fruit, right? I think in my space on smaller boats like pilot boats, ferries, then there's opportunity now. And for like the pilot boat, it uses a CCS connector, 360 kilowatts. It's the same as putting an EV charger in a car park. So it's really easy to do that and install it today. And even with the 150 passenger ferry going to Rockaway, there's only with the electric, with the foiling system reducing the demand on power, we only need a 700 kVA connection to charge that boat and run it all day. So I think there is a challenge around shore power for larger shipping, definitely. But I think there's a lot of opportunity with smaller vessels that do operate where people live, and we should be starting there and kind of really trying to drive that forward.
I think you have to start in phasing. I think you're going to need all of the above in order to reach your climate goals, right, of 2050 and to adapt. So really, like, no, I don't think you're going to burn like methanol and going to call it a day. I don't think so. I think like the capability to produce all that fuel is not there yet. You're going to need some sort of shore power.
We've got time for maybe one more question.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I'm Anjali. I'm with the Economic Development Corporation. I work on decarbonizing the cruise portfolio. One of the biggest challenges we face with advancing shore power is the cost of power. It's heavily subsidized, and it's not a sustainable long-term rate. And so I'm wondering, and actually cruise ships pay I think they're paying between 2 and 3 times the cost to plug in as they would if they were running diesel. And so it's just becoming sort of an untenable situation. And I'm wondering if you have encountered any ports who have grappled with the same issue, whether they've reached any sort of creative solutions with their local utility to reduce power costs.
I don't know that what I've seen at ports, primarily on the West Coast, are really comparable because their sort of power system is different. So, like Washington, no shore power rig yet, but they have a lot of hydropower. That said, one idea that I know some of the ports have discussed, it's not been tried, is trying to get differentiated power rates, right, for the people who are trying to do a good thing like ports and port electrification, and charging, higher rates for data centers or whatever. So that's one idea that I've heard some ports talked about. But really, I know I hear you about like cruise ships paying 2 or 3 times, but the latest numbers I've seen, like the 10 largest shipping companies, these are container companies, but I'm guessing it's going to be similar trends as cruise. Like they made, between 2020 and 2023, $3 billion in profits. And, in 2024, they added another 42 billion. So I just feel like this argument about like carriers and shipping companies not having enough to finance, I push back on that.
I would just say, who's telling you that? Yeah. Like, where's that coming from? Who's saying they can't afford to pay it? Who can't afford to pay it, I guess, is the question back to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we just have extraordinarily high electricity costs here because we have a unique sort of demand-based utility bill structure where it's like it's not based on the amount of power you consume, it's based on the peak demand in a given month. So that's a structural problem that we have to address. That's unique. I don't know how unique it is, but we certainly have it.
Yeah, but I mean, but But why is that stopping it? Because I get it's more expensive here, but also it's and you know, from a cruise perspective, this is a pretty prime market, so someone has to pay for it.
And also, can I mention that there was a agreement between Con Ed and NIPA ahead of time, and that the big delay was getting the agreement on the rate. There would be a lower rate for the cruise terminal because of the public benefit, right? So that was an agreement. It's still in place.
It's still in place, but it has an end date. It has an expiration date, so it needs to be renewed, especially if we're going to build this out across the harbor. We're part of a whole harbor-wide decarbonization plan, so this is going to be, you know, this is something that.
I spotted Con Edison sitting here in the front row. You can go talk to him.
I was not going to call on
Sorry,
John.
I was going to mention. I was going to suggest in Seattle. So it's also there's a big cruise port there, Seattle City Light, which is the utility owned by the city, managed by the city, has been working with the port on charging infrastructure, both shore power and hydrogen fuel cells for ferries. So they would be a good connection to make. And the other thing I would mention is there are ports who are struggling with the cost and demand because they just don't have enough demand from the vessels. So they would implement shared infrastructure that could be shared with like public transit. For example, Oslo is sharing the infrastructure between rollbacks and buses. And so like it's a multi-use project that gets then, you know, different types of funding. So that's another, you know, thing to think about.
Well, we are at time, so I want to say thank you to all four of our panelists. It's great to hear from you today.